Okay, so good morning, and thank you all for joining us for this morning's session. So I'm just going to provide a brief welcome on behalf of One Nucleus. My name is Alicia Gallier. I'm in the BD team, and we're delighted to have you on our session this morning. So we've got some experts lined up from Ernst & Young who are going to provide an overview of the funding options available for life sciences and their insights into applications and winning these grants. So before I hand over, just a few words on the housekeeping. I think we are keen for it to be an interactive session. So the idea is that we'll begin with the presentation, and then if throughout you have any thoughts and questions, you can utilize the chat box, and then at the end of the presentation, we will have some time reserved for the questions and where we can invite participants to unmute and ask questions directly. And just to highlight, excuse me, we are recording the session as well. So if you would like to put questions in the chat box and not be identified, then it is possible to send them to me privately. And I can then share that with our hosts today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Marche van der Steen, who is Head of Grants at Ernst & Young, and Jason Locking, who is a Tax Director. So with that, guys, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that and for the introduction. So I just thought it'd be good just to start off by introducing ourselves a little bit. So my name is Jason Locking. I'm a tax director based in Cambridge, and part of my role is to try and help link parts of EY in with people that are interested in hearing what we kind of know about what's going on with the industries, and help companies benefit from various reliefs within the tax area. A very important one of those is grants, and therefore I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues, Mache and Oliver, to run through what we're seeing out in respect of grants in the life science area, innovation funding generally, and some of our experiences, so we can share those with you. So then hopefully, when you're going through this journey yourself and applying for grants, etc., will help you with getting that sorted out and that sort of deal. I'm joined with Mache and Oliver, also joined by my colleague Ruby, who's our commercial manager, and kind of leads our relationship with One Nucleus, and reaching out to companies in the area. Mache, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would, yes. So Mache van der Steen, so I'm a senior manager within the Innovation Incentives team. So we sit, Oliver, could you maybe go on to the next slide, please? So we sit within tax in EY, which may be a little bit confusing to some of you, because obviously we're talking about grants here, which is a non-tax incentive, but that's just because we're part of the wider Innovation Incentives team. So hence also Jason's connection to that. So I particularly lead on the grants offering, which is one of the three offerings we have in Innovation Incentives, the other ones being R&D tax, which most of you are probably familiar with, and Patent Box. So the whole team is about 75 people. I think it's slightly more actually now. And basically we are part of a larger global team as well. So we collaborate with our EU, North American and other global colleagues quite a bit. So we're all, well, most of us are engineers and scientists by background. I'm an aerospace engineer, which isn't particularly helpful in life sciences, but I've done my fair share of life science clients in the past. And basically we try and take an engineering approach or a science approach to our clients, which means that we don't come at it from a financial services angle, but we rather try and understand the innovation and how that innovation is driving business growth, and try and leverage available grants to help accelerate that growth and accelerate that innovation development. So before I go on, I'll just let Oliver introduce himself as well, so you have a full picture of who you have on the call.
Yeah, thanks, Mache. So I'm Oliver Craig. I'm a senior advisor within the Innovation Incentives team. So I work more on the kind of delivery level of grants, which means that I work very much day to day with clients, helping them to kind of map out their innovation roadmap and then align that with funding opportunities. And yeah, I've been in the team for about 2.5 years, and I work generally across all sectors really. But yeah, I have in the last sort of 18 months worked on around about 10 or so grant applications within the bio area. So although I'm an engineer by background, life science is something that I'm fairly kind of comfortable and familiar with, and we work with various different funding streams within the life science space, which is something that we'll come on to a bit later. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Oliver. So before we jump to the next slide, if you have any questions while we go through it, if they're burning questions, please feel free to ask them over the chat. Otherwise, we can also cover questions at the end. We'll do a small poll in one of the next slides as well, so you can provide your answers in the chat as well if you'd like, and we much appreciate that. And other than that, the idea is really that we run through this, and you'll see that the presentation is fairly is relatively high level. It's just to provide you a bit of our insights, how we work, how we engage with clients, what sort of funding is available, and how to spot future funding opportunities as well. And then we'd really like to engage with you to sort of see what kind of thoughts you have around the funding landscape. If you have any particular questions, in particular around the UK leaving the EU properly this time, and things like that. So we can basically cover off those questions that you may have. Oliver, could you jump to the next slide, please? And the next one. So basically, we'll talk about what grants are, we'll talk about what eligible activities are, and finally, we'll talk about how we engage with our clients to basically help you benefit or help companies benefit from those grants. With the side note that we obviously work in the larger innovation incentives team. So we always try and optimize the overall funding picture that companies get. So for instance, some of you may be aware of the interaction between grants and the SME tax, R&D tax credits. We aim to optimize that as well, so we don't get you an incentive for something and that obviously costs you then incentive on the other side of the fence, which doesn't make a lot of sense holistically. Next slide, please, Oliver. Right, so before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I'd really like some feedback from the room, I guess, if we can still talk about the room in this day and age, around your experience with grants. So obviously we did a little bit of homework. We've seen that a couple of you companies already have successfully been allocated grants, but to get a bit of a feel, could you provide in the chat a number from 1 to 5 that gives us an indication of how aware you are of the grants landscape? I'll just give it a minute or so. Yeah, I can see that they're coming in. I can see a lot of 3s, I think. There's 1 5.
One of those 5s is from me, so that's cheating.
That is a bit cheeky, Oliver. So could I, and again, the session is being recorded, so if you don't want to speak on the session, then that's fine. But would the person who provided the 5, would you be able to provide some brief comments? Would you be happy to quickly speak about how you've used grants and how did you find the process?
Hi, my name's Bill Primrose. So I've had a number of Innovate UK grants and previously TSB. So I'm fairly au fait with working with Innovate UK. I'm interested in what's happening with Biomedical Catalyst, for instance, going forward.
And is the Biomedical Catalyst also the grant that you've applied for most and in the past as well?
No, it's Innovate UK.
Okay, well, Biomedical Catalyst is run through Innovate UK, but it's indeed a separate funding pot. Okay, brilliant. Let's not delve into the other ones too much. I think let's keep going. But obviously, if you have any questions, do let us know. Right. So shall we keep going to the next slide, Oliver? So I think this is where you pick up, Oliver. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Thanks, Maciej. So over the next few slides, I'll just give a kind of a general overview of what are grants. So obviously quite a few of you have already dealt with them in the past, so you have a decent idea of what they are. Hopefully there'll be a couple of new nuggets for you there, but also for some of the kind of the twos. Yeah, just aiming to provide a bit of an overview of what they might be able to do for you, and then yeah, how you'd go about applying. So to start with the basics, grants are discretionary financial incentives. So that's a key thing to be aware of. So unlike things like R&D tax, which you either qualify for or you don't, grants are discretionary, which means that even if you are fitting the scope of a competition, it's still up to you to convince a funding provider to award you funding. And a couple of examples here of recent projects that we've done has been just under 900K for a biomedical catalyst project looking at nanoparticles for difficult to treat cancers. And then another one, this is more of a capital funding scheme, was around about 2 million for the expansion of an R&D facility in the automotive sector. So that was basically an extension of the building, buying new kind of testing rigs and manufacturing equipment, and also kitting the building out with a load of heat pumps and solar panels to achieve kind of energy self-sufficiency. So if you apply for a grant and are then awarded it, you'll have a funding contract or funding agreement with various obligations. So what that means is in your grant application, you'll say, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and your funding agreement will essentially set out what you need to do in order to be paid, to be reimbursed by the funding authority. And that's a key thing to mention for the UK system. So all kind of major UK grant schemes are future looking, so they will not fund past activity. So possibly if you've worked in the innovation space in other countries, you'll be aware of schemes where you can complete a project and then apply for a grant for the project you've already done. That's not how it works here. In general, especially with things like Innovate UK, you won't be able to claim any funding for stuff that you have already done before the agreed start of a project date. Finally, worth touching on is what is now called the subsidy rules, but previously known as state aid. So essentially, now that we've left the previous EU system of state aid, the UK is now setting its own subsidy control rules. And we're not fully clear on what exactly that will mean, because there's currently a consultation. So the exact rules are yet to be set in stone. However, on the whole, we expect this to be more favorable to UK companies, because you may be familiar with the term undertaking in difficulty, which is essentially a fairly complicated financial condition, which predominantly affected pre-revenue SMEs when going for grant funding and ruled them ineligible on a technicality. Now, under the new scheme, the general aim is to make it more flexible to smaller companies. So we're expecting that, that should be less of a problem, rather than having to kind of fill out, do an exact analysis and come up with a number which rules you in or out. There's just a more broader rule that the company can't be in financial difficulty in order to receive a grant. So what exactly are the types of grants you can get, and where do these come from? I guess probably the biggest kind, and probably for the people on the call today of the greatest interest, would be innovation funding, and that usually comes from Innovate UK. As I mentioned on the previous slide, another thing which we also do is investments and job creation. So that's more on the kind of capital funding rather than innovation funding. And then in addition to that, you have all sorts of other grant funding schemes, including things like environmental protection. So if you have industrial processes and you're looking to improve efficiency or reduce carbon, there's funding available for that. And also, training and upskilling funds. So most innovation funding comes from Innovate UK, and they have all sorts of different challenges and schemes, because Innovate UK is essentially a platform for which all sorts of different types of funding are hosted. And these different funding sources are a bit of an alphabet soup. So you have ISCF, Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, then you have Biomedical Catalyst, Advanced Propulsion Center, Aerospace Technology Institute. There's a load of different kind of recurring funding competitions. Aside from that innovation funding, Other funding tends to be decentralized. So rather than coming from one place for the whole country, it's administered by local authorities, local government, and that includes LEPs, local enterprise partnerships. So there are, I think, 39 LEPs throughout the UK, and each one kind of sets its own, it has its own funding, and they set their own funding priorities. So they'll have a local industrial strategy, and they'll say, you know, we want to focus, for example, on automotive or training or, you know, life sciences. Those are the typical kinds of things that we see for those LEPs. So going on to the funding areas, this is an interesting slide, and this basically explains the two different types of funding, so how they can come from. The first, you have top-down funding, which is essentially where the government says, okay, we have particular goals. We want to strengthen the UK in particular areas. We see these things as being important. So they'll set out their priorities, and then from that, they will develop various kind of challenges and funding streams. So that includes things like the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund and the Biomedical Catalyst, along with all sorts of other theme competitions. So for example, healthcare is really a big focus, which is something I'll come on to in a second. There will be various funding streams through Innovate UK and other funding sources in order to support that. From the other side, you have bottom-up funding. And rather than seeking to fund specific activities with specific goals in mind, these are much more kind of open-ended. So you may well be familiar with SMART grants, formerly known as the Innovate UK or TSB Open competition. And that's essentially where you can put any project as long as it's sufficiently innovative in. So rather than having to be, you know, a particular life science project achieving certain goals and outcomes, this can just be anything that's innovative and is kind of good for the UK economy. There are also innovation loans, which work in the same way as SMART grants, but are designed for slightly later stage projects. And then things like DASA, which is defense funding. And again, if there's a technology which is sufficiently innovative and is likely to deliver a return on investment from a government grant, then yeah, that's when bottom-up funding comes into play. So the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund is worth nearly £5 billion. I think it runs until about 2023, 2024. So there are 4 key challenges within the ISCF, and I guess probably if you're in the life sciences space, probably these top 2 are of greatest relevance to you. So aging society kind of speaks for itself. It's all about maintaining health and independence into older age, and AI and data is increasingly being linked to health. So in some of the funding sources that we've seen recently, there's been a real focus on, you know, how can we make healthcare smarter and data driven? So from the ISCF, it's split into different waves of funding. And at first it was fairly slow and the competitions were a bit sporadic, but now we're in this 3rd wave of funding, and essentially they've kind of found their stride. So there's now fairly consistent funding competitions. So, you know, when one thing closes, the next one opens. And these are across a range of topics, but obviously one of the main ones probably of greatest interest here would be accelerating the detection of disease. I won't read all of those out, but all of those different topics kind of focus on particular areas, but they are quite sort of multidisciplinary. So you tend to find that there's a bit of overlap. So although you might think the only one that's relevant to you here would be, say, accelerating detection of disease, you would find that actually manufacturing made smarter, or you know, maybe even things like foundation industries, where that's looking at things like raw materials that go into other products, might be relevant to you. So the life sciences sector deal is something that the government has driven to basically reinforce the funding offered through Innovate UK. So in addition to just providing Innovate UK grants, they're also trying to encourage private investment and all sorts of other sources of funding to bolster what the government's making directly available. And that's really benefited the life sciences sector over the last couple of years. So now, just on my last couple of slides here, I'm going to go into the sort of the nitty gritty of what sort of costs you can include in a project and what would be funded. So on the whole, innovation grants don't cover capital costs. So although you can cover capital usage, depreciation costs, if you're looking to buy or refurbish a building or purchase a huge piece of equipment, then this is not for you. That would be a capital scheme. So innovation funding is much more geared towards operating expenditure. So that's mainly, personnel, labor costs, subcontractors, which is obviously really important, particularly if you're a small company. It's not expected that you would have all of the necessary skills in-house. And in addition, you have material costs, which would be any kind of consumables or lab supplies needed to realize your project. And you can also include travel costs, and there are certain permitted other costs. For example, if you're an SME, you're allowed to claim up to £7,500 to protect patents and intellectual property. So projects are match funded, which means you don't receive 100% of your project costs. So when you apply for a grant, you'll submit a application budget, which sets out all of the costs that you're including in your project. Of those costs, you typically get up to 70% for a small company, although it depends on the kind of research stream, so the stage of development and also the size of the company. So I have ED and IR there. So ED is experimental development, which is for sort of later stage projects, which typically receive a lower rate of funding, so more at the 45% for smaller companies end, up to industrial research, which is for the more kind of cutting edge stuff, which tends to attract the higher funding rates. And on the whole, I would imagine that the sort of projects that you would be going for would fall into that industrial research category. Especially to access larger amounts of funding, you usually have to collaborate, and there's usually a requirement that each collaboration includes an SME. So sorry, I'm just getting a bit of noise on the line there. You would normally need to collaborate on with other partners, and typically, in order to demonstrate that it's a meaningful collaboration, it's not just 95% one company and 5% another. Typically, only a maximum of 70% of the budget can go to one partner. So on the actual structure of the application itself, Innovate UK typically follows a 10-question format. So they cover certain themes. They're basically around what your idea is, what your team is, the markets for it, and then the kind of risks and project management, and finally the economic case for funding. So typically Innovate UK has used this 10-question format, but for recent competitions, we've seen that they've been varying it slightly, sometimes changing the order of things, changing the word counts, or adding extra competitions related to a specific funding theme. But on the whole, it's a fairly similar format, regardless of the funding stream that you're going for. Each application then goes to a panel of independent assessors, which usually includes people from industry and academia, who will assess your project, give it a score, and recommend whether it should receive funding. So if you receive above a certain score, you will then be shortlisted, and they weigh up all the final projects and make a selection of the final ones which should be funded. So it is usually the case that the highest scoring projects are the ones that are funded, but for example, if you have a fairly open competition that allows all sorts of different projects in, and you have 3 top scoring projects which are all looking at something very similar, they may take a portfolio approach, as they call it, which would basically mean, let's say there are 3 projects on cancer, so maybe they'd fund 1 or 2 of the cancer projects and look at something on malaria or cystic fibrosis or something like that, rather than just funding the 3 highest scoring ones. So finally, what makes a good application? The first thing, I guess, which is, although everything is important in terms of the narrative that you create in a grant application, the single most important thing has to be the scope. And that's simply because if you don't meet the scope of a competition, no matter how good your project is, they won't fund it. They will say this is out of scope and it won't even be passed on to assessment. So it's really important that you read the scope for each competition and check that what you're offering fits exactly within that scope. From then, you need to show that what you're trying to do has a general impact and relevance. So any grant is likely to have a massive impact to your company, but is it actually helpful to the sector? Will this lead to things like industry collaborations? Will this help to grow the sectors? Will this create export markets? All that kind of thing. Those are the things that they're really looking for. Those are the kind of the soft benefits of a project, in addition to simple things like job creation and bringing a new innovative product or solution to market. The other thing is that your project has to be credible. So it's easy to write that you're going to do this and that, and you're going to bring something wonderful to market and deliver billions of pounds of revenues within a year or two. But obviously you need to make clear how you're going to do that and convince the assessors that you will be able to do that. And that's through showing that you have the right team and experience, and also showing that you have sensible approaches to kind of time and project management, and a sensible approach to risk. And obviously, if we were working with you on a grant application, that's something that we can really help you to emphasize. Finally, value for money. Basically, the amount of money that you're asking for has to be appropriate for the work that you're planning to do, and then for the outputs of your project, you have to deliver a sensible level of output. So a key thing to say is that you don't always have to deliver a brilliant finished product at the end of your grant. More often, you're just kind of reaching a demonstrator or prototype stage, and that's fine. But you should consider that in the amount of money that you're asking for. If you are looking to bring something to market within a couple of years and solve an immediate and pressing problem, then there's potentially a justification for £2 or £3 million in funding. If you're doing something which is on a much smaller scale, that's absolutely brilliant, and they'll be really keen to discuss that and fund that with you. But you should be asking for 300, 400, 500,000 rather than talking about millions. So thanks very much for that. I will pass you back over to Maciej.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I just had a trouble unmuting myself there. So I think we've talked in general terms now about the funding landscape. I will make some comments about the biomedical catalyst, because I know that's something that's quite of interest to a lot of you on the call. However, we would like to talk about how we approach in practice preparing companies for grant applications, helping them make those grant applications and drive essentially successful projects. So obviously the 4 value points that Oliver mentioned are, I would say, the key ingredients of any grant application. How you make sure that you manage them throughout the process is really important. So Oliver, could you just pop on to the next slide, please? I'm just looking at the chat if there's a question. There's a question, what if the project is not very innovative, but would fulfill an area of unmet need, but not be very profitable and not likely to be done without outside funding? That's a great question. Maybe we can delve into a little bit more detail later, but I would say profitability is only one of the value adds that you can have as a project. So essentially the way you need to look at it is the scope, and we'll come on this slide, we'll come to that a little bit, but the scope that the government sets out in the funding program is really the boundary conditions of what they would like to fund, right? So for instance, a biomedical catalyst isn't going to fund electric vehicles because it's just not the intention of the funding program. So if you fall within that, then basically you can apply with any given project. We have applied with projects that don't necessarily produce a monetary value for the applicant, but produce a lot of societal good. So in that particular case, that could still work. It's all value for money assessment. So basically, if innovation is, there needs to be an innovation element, but it could be either technological innovation, scientific innovation, business innovation, a very wide range. So maybe we can delve into this question a little bit more at the end, but I would say there is, it looks like there could still be a funding case made around this sort of project. So just to give you a little bit of more background around what I was saying just now, when you think about how a grant is shaped, and this is something that the slide that Oliver showed, the complex one with the tree going down and up, essentially, with how funding programs are developed. Basically, funding calls exist to drive future government policy. So it's very nice to have a policy, but something like digitized healthcare, personal healthcare, how do you drive that? There is going to be a certain unmet need in terms of technological advances that need to be used. For instance, driving AI for detection of disease. That doesn't currently exist. So for that policy to actually have a real life result, you need to develop certain technology. So basically what happens is that based on the policy, the government will analyze what sort of development is necessary to achieve the objectives set out in that policy. They will then allocate budgets to stimulate the industry and I would say the country as a whole to move into that direction. So one of the things that we do very often with our clients is looking, without looking necessarily at funding, looking at what the company is trying to do, what the mission of the company is, where they're going with their innovation, with their growth and strategy, and how that aligns with future government policies. And once you start constructing it like that, you can already plan where intersections between the company's activities may be with future funding streams. And you can then also identify the right funding programs when they come along, and basically being able to link back the benefits that a project is driving all the way back to policy that is actually driving the scope of the competition is very, very relevant. So I would say one of the key takeaways is don't just sandbox yourself by looking at purely the scope of the funding competition, but think broader in terms of what impacts you have on policies that the government is setting out. Okay, I just read the chat. That's fine. We can use the chat as well rather than talking live. Oliver, could you jump to the next call, please? Sorry, next slide. Right, so we obviously wouldn't be a service provider if we didn't have a nice flow chart of how we address working with our clients. So basically, this is quite a complex slide, I think, but what it does show is that funding is a competitive landscape, so it doesn't really make sense to jump into an application because we think a project is good. It makes sense to have a stepwise approach, analyze whether it fits the competition, whether it fits the scope, whether we think there is a value for money statement. So even though a project may fit the competition on paper, you always need to think, will it stand a chance in the grander scheme of things in getting funded? So once we have a candidate project, we'll do a scope alignment check. We will look basically at how well that's meeting the scope. Does the company have all the competences? Are there any additional competences that need to be maybe onboarded? That will drive a partner search. So it's not for the sake of having a partner on board. It's really to drive the scope development in a way that will fit the competition best. Then you can have another recheck of the scope. So basically, how well do you fit the scope now? It is at this point as well that you can engage with people like the KTN, from Innovate UK as well, various types of people who can basically give you a steer on how well you fit the scope of the competition. Once that is done, you can move on to a drafting of basically the application. So I would say a lot of work goes in before you start answering the questions of the actual funding application. That's mostly a distraction, I would say, until you have a complete visibility of your scope. So once you start the drafting, you obviously then review it, preferably peer review your application, because obviously once you're in it yourself, it's very hard to spot any inconsistencies or spot any things that aren't necessarily correct. You then submit it, and then, as a lot of you may know, if you go for something like a biomedical catalyst, there will be sort of an interview process, which is really a panel where you have to present your project, and typically that takes a little bit more of a free form. So that's really where you need to make a judgment call what information you do include and what you don't include. At that point, there's, as a lot of you are familiar probably as well, a lot of admin going on behind the scenes, because you get your grant, you need to look through the terms and conditions. You may even have to overcome an undertaking and difficulty test, although, as Oliver was saying, that one is being phased out, and it's more of a case by case analysis that's being done around the viability of a business to actually grow and deliver the project. So that's the due diligence phase. Then you start the project, you deliver the project, and hopefully you then successfully deliver and close the project. And during that phase, you obviously need to report to Innovate UK as well, or to any other funding body, how you're spending the money, and make funding requests as you go along. So it's very rare that you get a pot of money up front to spend, and you basically report on it after you've spent it, but usually you have to report on it as you go along on a quarterly basis, and you then get payments towards your expenses. Once you then close your project, very often, as is the case in research and innovation, there is more activities that come from it. So for instance, if you're familiar with the technology readiness level, which is basically the technological maturity of your project, it may be that there is still development to be done to lift the work to something that's commercially viable. So you may then think again about how you could leverage grants for that. But I think what is very important is knowing that you need to have a really strong proposal, and that starts with a strong project, but it also starts with, it also is based on how you word that and how you analyze all the impacts and the value points for the government, and you really need to bring that out in the application. And if you feel a candidate project isn't that strong, I would say don't be afraid to walk away from it, because time spent on an unsuccessful proposal is really a waste of time, and there's a lot of effort you can be putting into something else as a business to actually drive your business forward. Next slide, please, Oliver. Right, so I don't want to linger too much on this slide, but this is basically how we approach a grant application process. We analyze a project. We do a preliminary check of how well it fits the scope. Once we feel it fits the scope, we go through the concept development phase, which is really talking with all the partners, making sure that all the value points are drawn out, and only once that is completely validated. So you will get these slides afterwards, so you can have a look at this in detail. But once we have full clarity of what the project is going to do, what the cost is, what the case for funding is essentially, so what all the value points are for the government to fund you, only then do we start to work on the application. And I think that point is really critical, not to get yourself distracted by looking at the actual application questions, but thinking at it from a project perspective more than from an application perspective, if that makes sense. Right, Oliver, could you jump onto the next slide, please? So how we engage with companies in practice is we obviously help them with full applications, but we also do what we call a proposal health check, a pre-mortem. So basically, before you apply for a fund, we can have a peer review of it, make some adjustments, make comments how you can strengthen the proposal. Now, I would say this sort of thing doesn't really make sense 1 or 2 days before the deadline. It's typically about 2 weeks before the deadline that there's really value that can be driven from this sort of approach. We also do, mostly for bigger companies, landscape reviews, which basically means that companies that have a lot of different innovation activities, where could they be aligning with the government's funding agenda, and hence where could they be identifying funding options. And then we also help with the project management, so the compliance and reporting that happens to Innovate UK, any scope change requests, things like that. We can help with that as well. So obviously, once you have your grant award, it's at that point that you need to start implementing the project and showing that you're on track with that as well. And last, I would say funding planning is a little bit more, once we have done the landscape review, you can really plan out when to start applying, what are backup options if you don't get funded. So we always think about what happens if you don't get the grant as well, and make contingency plans for that sort of thing. So I know there was a comment in the beginning that I'd like to pick up around the biomedical catalyst, which is probably one of the programs of most interest to the group on the team here, on the call here. So the biomedical catalyst used to be a long-running funding program specifically to stimulate medical technologies mostly, with a big focus on cancer treatment as well. And a couple of years ago, it got restricted to small and medium enterprises, which was actually quite a good move, because those are the ones that are driving a lot of the innovation that we're seeing in digital healthcare and precision medicine. The last funding call was a one-off from a budget perspective. That one closed, I think it was September from memory. And I've been in touch with the right people at Innovate UK since. It's looking like there will be another funding call in summer this year. But again, this will be a one-off call, so there isn't necessarily a budget to have a longer program than that. So it looks like there will be, well, at least one more funding round for the biomedical catalyst. The only thing I will say is that the biomedical catalyst has become very, very competitive for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that it's obviously a kind of a bespoke funding mechanism for biomedical companies, which means it's the logical stop for those, but also because the frequency of funding has been much reduced, which means that obviously more people are applying for one single round. There is simply less money available via the biomedical catalyst. So already in the last round of funding, there's been quite a few very strong proposals that haven't received funding. So if you're one of them, it definitely makes sense to resubmit. If you weren't one of them, I would make sure that you really assess very rigorously how well you align with the upcoming competition and get all the support from Innovate UK and other stakeholders that you can to make sure before you go in that your project actually stands a chance of getting funded. Because obviously it's easy to spend a lot of time. It's one of the more complex applications you can make. It's easy to spend a lot of time and not get funding then. So the other option that I'd quickly like to highlight, I don't know if everybody knows of this program, is the National Institute for Health Research. They also run a number of different funding programs that are a little bit more accessible than the biomedical catalyst. The amount of funding is maybe a little bit less, but basically it's still worth going for. The other option, which is very unpopular, is the SMART grant, because that's a bit of a fist fight really to get funding through that as well. But we have been successful in biomedical applications through the SMART grant as well. So it's definitely something worthwhile considering, especially if you're doing one into the SMART and the biomedical catalyst at the same time, which basically spreads your options. I would say though that it does make sense to sort of revamp the proposal a little bit. So don't just copy paste it across because you're doing multiple applications. And I can see a comment of somebody who scored 88% of the biomedical catalyst, got to the panel stage and did not get funding. The problem is succeeding at the interview stage. I would say yes. The interview stage is a very important part of the application process. At the same time, obviously without being on the panel, it's hard for us to assess if a problem occurred there. But what happens a lot as well with Innovate UK, and you'll see that in the small print of the scope, that Innovate UK takes a portfolio approach to funding projects. So in other words, if there's a biomedical catalyst and they have 20 million and they get 15 million worth of cancer diagnosis projects that are all excellent, they won't all get funded because there is a risk of double funding. So I think you're right, based on the comment that the interview panel are comparing apples with pears. It is indeed very hard, and part of that is the portfolio approach as well. But typically, all I can say is that we do help companies through that process as well. We've been successful helping them through the even the biomedical catalyst through the panels. And what is really important is showing that growth potential and alignment with a critical need within the UK, I would say medical space. So I'm very happy to pick up on this discussion, because obviously I know it's an intimate discussion around your proposal. I'm very happy to pick that up. Have a look at your pitch that you did in the interview panel, and see if there's anything immediate that we can identify that could strengthen it in the next round. Very happy to pick that up separately or on the call now if you'd like to speak. But definitely, again, don't underestimate the panel. Oliver, I think we have one more slide. Right, I'll just try and clean up my screen a little bit. So a couple of case studies. Again, I don't want to talk through all of them because we've already spent quite a lot of time talking ourselves. We did help a medical startup secure 900K through the Biomedical Catalyst. You'll see that on one of the earliest slides. We have a testimonial from that company. It's Xerion Healthcare. Basically, they were doing a nanoparticle to help in the treatment of head and neck cancer specifically. So that nanoparticle sits within the tumor and helps using radiation to treat the cancer rather than chemotherapy. Basically, it's for those tumors that are not really reacting well to chemo and that are in the wrong place to use radiotherapy on, because it would damage surrounding tissues such as the brain or something like else. So that's really a very specific, very niche project that helps address a very specific need. And you'll notice I use the word specific quite often. Don't try to change the world. Try to change the little thing that you're really good at, right? And drive that particular bit through in the application. So the complete opposite, we're helping a multinational assess alignment with UK funding programs, prioritize research projects. So obviously you can imagine large companies have very large lists of potential innovation projects. Where do they invest in? Those sort of questions we get quite a lot. The other one I wanted to pick up on is the automotive company that Oliver was mentioning in the beginning as well. The reason why I want to pick it up is not because it's automotive, because that's not that relevant for the group, but I think what is really relevant is that we made the request there for 50% of funding for what basically was buying equipment. So that sounds like a lot of funding, and actually the way we did it is by qualifying it as research and development infrastructure, which it actually was, right? So the company just didn't realize that this isn't simple equipment to make parts in their testing laboratory, but that actually is going to drive their innovation and collaborative innovation as well with their clients and other suppliers. So it's about sometimes taking a step back and saying, well, actually, what is it that you want to do with this equipment? How is it going to drive your growth? And how could the government contribute to that happening? And in this particular case, it's been an amazing success, because we've seen that this company is now hiring a lot of staff, from other automotive companies, and basically driving a lot of growth off the back of this investment project. So they've really taken a step up, got a lot of research and development staff on, which underlines that sometimes it's really important to have a look at what that particular investment is going to do. So there is a strategic thinking element to applying for grants as well, and thinking about, well, if you can get a grant, what do you really want to do with it? Sometimes it means you can think a little bit bigger than you were thinking initially, and you can actually derive more value from it as well. Very last point, there is a multinational as well that we're doing peer reviews of proposals for. So that's a fairly light touch service that we do. But basically, we review their proposals once they've submitted them, once they've written them themselves, to provide them with some comments before they submit it. And this is something they find quite useful, because obviously you think from inside your own comfort zone when you prepare those, and having some outside pointers can actually help it get across the line. So I will stop talking now, and I'll take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, Maciej, just before we open up the floor, I've had a question that's come through to me privately, which is worth quickly addressing. So what are the advantages of a grant versus R&D tax credits? So feel free to chime in here as well, Maciej, but to me, there are two key differences. So first things first, a R&D tax credit looks back at what you've done. So you can claim R&D tax credits for your last 2 accounting periods. So that's basically claiming an incentive back on the work that you've already done, whereas a grant is completely forward-looking. So yes, you should absolutely be claiming R&D tax credits on the activity that you've done, but grants are instrumental in allowing you to achieve your kind of full innovation roadmap by potentially letting you achieve things more quickly and reach the market more quickly with new solutions. But the key thing is that they're looking at different different stages of innovation. A grant will help you to plan out future projects. The other thing is that grants are typically much more generous than R&D. So it depends on whether you're, for a small company, it depends on whether you're profitable or loss making and everything, but you get round about a third of your R&D expenditure back as a tax credit. But with a grant, if you go for an industrial research grant, you could get up to 70% of your eligible costs. So there is the potential for a grant to be more generous. There are a few nuances in the way that they interact with each other. And again, this is something that will be clarified once we understand how the new subsidies system works. But essentially, under the previous scheme, basically a grant is considered to be state aid, and so is the SME higher rate of R&D tax credit. So you just need to be careful that you're essentially not claiming state aid twice on the same set of expenditure. But as we understand things, as things change under the new system, that's only going to become more favourable to SMEs. I don't know if there are any other thoughts that you had there, Maciej, but that was just the key thing I wanted to cover off, difference between R&D and grants. Yeah,
so I think, and everything you said is obviously true, right? But I think very critically within a grant, part of what you need to prove is that the grant is going to help you achieve something that you wouldn't achieve without the grant. So by default, the grant is going to help you achieve more than if you would do SME credits alone. The other point is that R&D SME credits are backward looking. They're an incentive for doing things, obviously, and they're great because they're low risk. But at the same time, they don't drive necessarily commercial value. They don't drive collaboration. So what we find and what the most successful grant applications are, there is an element of driving research all the way to commercialization. So basically going from idea to invoice is what we like to call it. So usually what it takes is, unless a lot of your companies will obviously be things like spin-offs from universities, you'll have specific technologies that you're building up yourselves. But if you're not doing that, sometimes it makes sense to have an academic partner who's driving that scientific excellence, and at the same time involving maybe an end user, which could even be the NHS, into your project as well, which will basically show your first route to market. So there's a lot more value you can derive from a grant than just a monetary value. That is something that sounds a bit corny, but it is actually true, and we found that is actually true as well. And that's why a lot of large companies are playing the grants game, although they don't really need the money and they have very, very small additions to projects, but they do like to use that to explore new technologies, for instance. And likewise, as a smaller company, you can collaborate with big potential end users of what you're doing through a grant. So lots of benefits, I would say. And I would even go as far as to say that thinking about your future plans from a grant perspective, which is basically think about the grant funding body like an investor. Why would they fund you? So thinking about all the benefits you're bringing out, thinking about the risks you may have in your project and things like that is a very useful exercise to do. So I know it's hard not getting funded if you submit a proposal, and I definitely wouldn't suggest writing Innovate UK applications without submitting them, but there is value in doing that even if you don't get the funding from a business perspective, especially if you look at it from a project-centric way rather than delve straight into the templates.
Yeah, thanks, Maciej. So I guess just a final key takeaway is it's not grants versus R&D. Ideally you want to be using both, and that's one of the things that we help companies to do. Look at all of the things they're doing and working out how that they can combine all the different incentives available to them to maximize what they're receiving. I don't think we've got any other questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question, feel free.
Whilst we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I'd just like to extend my thanks to Maciej, Oliver and Jason for sharing this very useful and interesting update today. And I will be doing a follow-up email after the session. So very happy to connect anyone who'd like to follow up with our experts today. So just let me know and we can agree that in advance. But yes, if there are any more questions, it's a perfect opportunity to ask them directly. So yes. And if not, we are pretty much up to time, so very well timed as well.
And obviously a lot of you will be thinking about your specific projects and things like that. So we're very happy to pick it up post call on a. We're happy to sign NDAs as well. We're happy to have obviously an informal chat about your project and you know, figure out the best way forward for you. That doesn't necessarily include us providing you service. Just to make that very clear, we're not pushing on that. But we do like to connect to different companies, even to understand your barriers in terms of accessing funding, because that even is interesting information for us, and hopefully we can provide you some pointers that can help you overcome those barriers.
Have you seen them? Actually, there's one
I'm
last
just
question
reading.
in there.
I'm just reading through it. Yeah. So this is an answer to Veronica on early detection and diagnostics project. So there is quite a bit of things coming through from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund that could be interesting for this as well. It will depend a little bit. It will depend a little bit on the exact scope of what you're doing. So it's hard to say based on the sentence, but I think the National Institute for Health Research looks quite good. And the biomedical catalyst could be one as well. The most important thing I would say, if you're early stage, early detection and diagnostics project, what do you mean by early? So in other words, where do you sit with your TRL level? And please make an appropriate funding request. So sometimes it feels like it makes sense to go for, I don't know, a 3-year project that will go all the way from a technology readiness level 2 or 3 all the way up to 7 or 8. But actually maybe that's just not believable, because an expert who will look at it will say, well, you know, your work program, you can never plan it out so far. So then your credibility goes out the window. Whereas if you would go for a smaller pot of money of maybe 200K initially, you would be much more likely to get it. So again, it's hard to say based on the comment you provided, but I would say that definitely Innovate UK funding could work depending on how your technology readiness level is and what your route to market is. National Institute for Health Research could definitely work as well, in particular if the PDA one in particular, if there's obviously a strong use case within the NHS. So I will be happy to pick that up again separately if that makes sense. Having a quick chat, I think, could help clarify what your options are.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Just making a note.
Okay, so if there aren't any further questions, then I think we're on the hour now. So yeah, just to extend my thanks again to all those who joined as attendees and to Ernst & Young for sharing their expertise today. Yes, indeed, as Isabel says, that's very useful. Thank you. So I'd just like to wish everyone a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.